annual member outing to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. It means a lot that we can all gather here, and I know we had a long meeting today, but we also had the opportunity to share each other's company in such a beautiful location. So thanks to the Lake Erie group for hosting us up here. This has been an absolutely wonderful place, and we've been lucky that the weather's held out. So again, thank you for being here. I know some of you made a long trip, and we're so happy to spend this time with you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dave Sublette to introduce our speaker.
Well, this is an important year. Sierra Club and other organizations throughout the United States are celebrating the 50th anniversary. It's become a really big deal in most states. We wouldn't be having this celebration if it weren't for one person who is responsible for writing the document. What is that? His name was Howard Zahniser. And Howard is now with his family. He's buried at Tionesta, his home. And we're very fortunate tonight to have a member of the Zahniser family here. And it's Howard's grandson, Justin Duewel-Zahniser. So if you'd welcome him, I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting talk. Justin, thanks.
Thank you. All right, so first off, I'd like to thank you all for helping to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Wilderness Act. I'd also like to thank Dave Sublette for getting me here, all the way from Maryland. I think, and Dave, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think you and my father, Ed Zahniser, first met at the 40th anniversary celebration of the Wilderness Act.
Yes.
2004,
we go
right?
quite a ways back.
Quite a ways back, at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And then I think they met again in 2006 at the celebration of the 100th anniversary of my grandfather Howard Zahniser's birth, held in nearby Warren, Pennsylvania.
What year was that?
Let's see, that was 2000. Well, the 100th anniversary of his birth, 2006. Yeah. So, my grandfather, who a lot of people knew as Zahni, was born here in western Pennsylvania. This is the birth region also of Rachel Carson, Edward Abbey, and Pennsylvania Congressman John P. Saylor. You probably know of Rachel Carson's pioneering work in documenting pollution. DDT in her day was basically used like a wonder drug, if you can believe that. President John F. Kennedy actually referred to her book Silent Spring, which you may have heard of, in a televised speech. The chemicals industry put men in white coats on television to say, "What does she know? She's a woman." Now, I don't know if you've ever met a woman, but they actually know a lot. And I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that probably most, if not all of you, have a mother. And so I have a mother, Christine Duewel, hence the Duewel-Zahniser. She happens to be a woman, and I distinctly remember her knowing a lot when I was growing up. So Rachel Carson was a research scientist. She collected buckets of seawater. She studied the contents. She honed her writing skills on government reports. Rachel Carson and my grandfather, Zahni, worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the early 1940s. But they met only later after Zahni went to work for the Wilderness Society in 1945. One day, my father, Ed Zahniser, in his National Park Service cubicle, got a phone call from Rachel Carson's biographer, Linda Lear. Linda Lear was looking for letters between Carson and Zahni. My dad mentioned that Carson's research assistant, Bet Haney, was a school friend of my Uncle Matt's wife, Ann Harrington Zahniser. So Lear said, "I haven't been able to find her," and my dad said, "Well, I'll call my sister-in-law." So Aunt Ann called her friend Sharon Foster, who indeed had Haney's phone number. And this is all by way of saying that in the 1950s and the early 1960s, conservation was a fairly small world. Pennsylvania's Allegheny National Forest has two wilderness areas: the 8,630-acre Hickory Creek and the 372-acre Allegheny Islands Wilderness areas. Together, they comprise only 2% of the National Forest land area. By contrast, the average national forest has 18% of its land area designated as wilderness. There are several more areas proposed as wilderness for the Allegheny. I understand from Dave that your Sierra Club group is focused on the proposed Chestnut Ridge and the Minster Wilderness areas for now. That's correct. Minster, is it? Minster. So I hope you will continue to work imaginatively and persistently to turn those proposals into designated wilderness areas. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. It's out of curiosity. If you know the answer, pretend you were shy in high school and don't shout it out. We don't want to flood the recording here. If you don't know the answer, just take a completely wild guess. Basically, pretend you're in Congress. Okay. So here's the question. 375 members of the U.S. House of Representatives voted on the final wilderness bill in August of 1964. How many members of the House of Representatives do you think voted for it, and how many voted against it? Think about that. Okay? So I'm gonna do what's called a slow roll here and tell you the Senate vote first, just to draw this out. The earlier Senate vote on the final bill was 73 to 12. Okay? The House vote was 374 to 1. You couldn't get a vote like that today if the issue was apple pie. Congress would get hung up on questions like, well, is the crust made from subsidized wheat from my congressional district? The lone nay vote was a freshman member of Congress from Texas. Texas came into the United States as a republic, and in 1964 there was little federal public land in Texas. The freshman may not have known what he was even voting on, but he had a sense of humor apparently. Years later, when he was quizzed on his Lone Star descent, he said, "I voted against it because it didn't go far enough." So my grandfather, Howard, is considered the Wilderness Act's primary author and chief lobbyist. But Zahni was not at the White House for the signing of the act. He died on May 5, 1964. My grandmother, Alice Zahniser, who passed away Tuesday evening at the age of 96, stood for Zahni in the White House Rose Garden on September 3rd, 1964. President Lyndon Johnson gave her one of the pens he used to sign the act, which is an old presidential tradition. And that pen is now a cherished family possession. So what does the Wilderness Act do? The Wilderness Act preserves wilderness by law, not by administrative decision. That's the historical significance for our federal public lands, lands we as citizens all own in common. The Wilderness Act is a protective legal overlay to parts of national parks and national forests, U.S. fish and wildlife refuges, and, since 1976, Bureau of Land Management lands. Only Congress can designate a wilderness area, and only Congress can change a wilderness boundary. So keep in mind this idea of wild by law. In the 1920s and the 1930s, U.S. Forest Service workers Aldo Leopold and Bob Marshall had persuaded the Forest Service to create wilderness areas administratively. Leopold saw the Forest Service create the Gila Wilderness Area in New Mexico in 1924. Bob Marshall, a magnetic and dynamic New York millionaire bureaucrat, later convinced the Forest Service to protect some roadless areas as quote-unquote primitive areas. Again, primitive areas only had administrative protection. But Bob Marshall died in 1939, and World War II's end in 1945 saw pent-up demand for housing. All the troops come home, time to build. Those administrative wilderness and primitive area boundaries started to shrink to increase timber cuts, mining, and hydropower dam projects. The Wilderness Society was organized around Bob Marshall in 1935. My grandfather was a charter member of the Wilderness Society. The founders included Benton Mackay. In the 1920s, Mackay helped found the discipline of regional planning. In 1921, Mackay proposed an Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia. He also prophesied interstate highways. He said, quote-unquote, townless highways would go from point to point with no reference to towns en route. Mackay proposed the Appalachian Trail as a wilderness belt, not a mere recreational footpath. Mackay's wilderness belt would block and halt urban sprawl, what Mackay called the Iron Glacier. Since then, urban greenbelts have been used to limit sprawl. Mackay proposed small communities along his wilderness belt whose residents would keep traditional Appalachian lifeways alive. Mackay's overarching goal was to keep wilderness and wildness in contact with the urban core. He knew Henry David Thoreau's work inside and out, which means he once met a man who went fishing with Thoreau. My aunt Karen Zahniser Batachi recalled that the four Zahniser kids always spoke of Mackay by both names, Benton Mackay. Never just Benton, never just Mackay, Benton Mackay. He didn't drive, and my grandfather often brought him to dinner at their suburban home outside Washington, D.C. My grandmother would try to convince Mackay to stay overnight to save them driving back into the city. But Benton always refused, saying, "I'll only stay when I can stay a sheet's worth, Alice." So, in other words, he wouldn't stay unless he was staying more than one night. Mackay, who was Harvard class of 1900 and an MA in 1905 in forestry, thought of everything in tight, dramatic scenes, whether it was forestry, labor, education, or wilderness. Drama really imbued the Mackay clan's blood. His actor and playwright father, so you can see where he gets it, led an itinerant drama troupe. In 1945, Mackay, as the Wilderness Society's president, offered my grandfather Howard the job as executive secretary and editor of the society, for those of you familiar with living wilderness. My grandmother, Alice Zahniser, was at that time 6 months pregnant with my father, their fourth child in a planned family of 3 children, which worked out well for me, so. Now, do not think of the Wilderness Society in 1945 as one of today's 7 sisters of the environmental movement. The environmental movement really lay 25 years in the future. To leave 15 years as a successful federal bureaucrat for a conservation startup with no pension was a really tough decision for my grandfather to make. But my grandmother told him to do what makes you happy. Again, what do women know, right? In 1945, Zani and a half-time secretary were the society's entire Washington office. The mammologist Olis Murray was named half-time director, and Murray worked from his home in Moose, Wyoming. Zani once said that after he went to work for wilderness, he went to wilderness less often. That was a bit of hyperbole, but of the top 12 values Americans place on wilderness, number 4 is the legacy value, which is to say the value of knowing that future generations will have wilderness areas. And the number 8 value is the existence value, or simply the value of knowing that wilderness areas exist. In fact, when Zani was hired at the Wilderness Society, some members of the governing council were concerned that he wasn't enough of a wilderness man, as they phrased it. Indeed, recent writers have pictured him as more like a librarian than an outdoorsman. Zani was born here in western Pennsylvania in 1906. Although born in Franklin, he came to consider Tionesta his childhood home. His parents honored books and education. His father was an often unsalaried minister, later a district elder in the denomination. Zani grew up barely on the money economy, and later surrounded himself and his family with books. My grandmother Alice drew the line at one sacred spot left, which was the top of the refrigerator. An elementary school teacher had interested my grandfather in birds and the Junior Audubon Society. His love of birds expanded from there to basically the whole of the natural world. From 1930 to 1943, he worked for the U.S. Bureau of Biological Survey and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's where he got his start in bureaucracy. He was mentored by the naturalist Edward Preble, for whom my father is named, and thence my middle name, and my son's middle name. We all share that distinction with the Preble's Meadow jumping mouse, although I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Zani also previously met Olis Murray as early as 1937, hosting Olis on my grandfather's federal radio program about wildlife. Murray had just returned from an Alaskan wildlife expedition at that point. By 1935, Zani was also the books editor of Nature magazine, writing his monthly essay and review for a quarter century. To honor John Muir's 100th birthday in 1938, Zahni read or reread all of Muir's in-print books. My grandfather was attracted to wilderness work in the 1930s by his admiration for the people involved. He was later aghast at the use of atomic bombs over Japan. If that was technology's crowning achievement, he thought, shouldn't we redefine progress? As my grandmother once told me, he was physically ill for several days after he heard the news of that event. His family heritage just assumed that we had to leave the world a better place. So that's just how he grew up. These people and these concerns and his love of nature really sort of motivated his life working for wilderness. By 1945, as Zahni moved to the Wilderness Society, the administratively designated wilderness areas were melting, as Bob Marshall had once said, like snowbanks in the summer. In 1947, the Society's governing council voted to seek some form of more permanent protection for wilderness on federal public lands. And that launched a 17-year journey toward the Wilderness Act that you and I are celebrating this evening. A 1949 Legislative Reference Bureau report on U.S. wilderness resources was the first salvo for the wilderness legislation. Zahni wrote solicitous letters to an Ohio member of Congress asking him to request the report. Luckily, Wilderness Society Treasurer Ernest Griffith headed the Legislative Reference Bureau. Given the requests even from the wilds of Ohio, Ernest Griffith got out an exhaustive report. And my grandfather was able to use that widely to promote wilderness in Congress and with other conservation groups and potential cooperators. Then in 1950, the dam-building U.S. Bureau of Reclamation basically handed the conservationists the ideal issue to galvanize support for wilderness. The Bureau of Reclamation proposed to dam the Green River at Echo Park in Dinosaur National Monument, part of the national park system. The dam would also impound the lower Yampa River, which flows into the Green River there. If even national parks lacked permanent protection, the conservationists argued, then the wildness of no federal public land is permanently protected. Zahni and David Brower, who then headed the Sierra Club, built the first ever National Conservation Coalition to fight the Echo Park Dam. This was the issue they were looking for, and they were able to use it. Now, don't think of the Sierra Club back then as one of today's seven sisters of environmentalism. It was still the Sierra Club of California. Brower had to cajole the members of the club to support this issue all the way over in Utah. And actually stamped into the bottom of my grandfather's old Sierra Cup were the words Sierra Club of California. I think they're done differently since then. The 1950s Bureau of Reclamation had carte blanche from the Congress and the Eisenhower administration to willy-nilly dam the American West, if you'll excuse the two uses of that word. It was lunacy to think that you could defeat Echo Park Dam. That was a crazy proposition. But as my grandfather's close colleague Olis Muri rightly said, Zahni has unusual tenacity in lost causes. Unusual tenacity in lost causes. Against all odds, the conservationists had defeated the dam proposal by 1955. And then they took that coalition, their national coalition that they built there, to work on the National Wilderness Law. Zahni drafted the first wilderness bill in early 1956 at my grandparents' dining room table in suburban Hyattsville, Maryland. Zahni used his round Black Warrior brand pencils and a ruled pad. My grandmother, Alice, typed it up. Zahni found drafting legislation quite daunting. He wrote to a colleague at the time, "I am no bill drafter. If I had to do this again, I would much prefer to state all this in rhyming iambic couplets, or even in sequence of sonnets, than attempt to do this in bill language." And on top of that, he was a bit of what I call a spear fisher. So my grandmother was able to work all 10 of her fingers and speed up the process. Wilderness Act historian Doug Scott writes that, in fact, the poet in Zahni made him the ideal draftsman. He crafted in the earliest drafts the masterful, evocative phrases of today's Wilderness Act. The Act's definition of wilderness is often cited for its writerly quality. Quote, "A wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain." U.S. News and World Report magazine wrote that the Wilderness Act's language, quote, "tiptoes as close to poetry as legalese ever comes." Zahni's lifelong immersion in the Hebrew Scriptures book of Job and writings by Italian poet Dante Alighieri, English poet and engraver William Blake, and Henry David Thoreau inform both the language and the spirit of the Act. Job discovers that he was created with nature, not apart from nature. Dante, Blake, and Thoreau protested the overweening and overemphasis on capital R reason and the unquestioned so-called progress, and they imagined their worlds anew. The Wilderness Act's unusual word, untrammeled, was a carefully considered choice. Best to let Zahni himself explain it to you as he explained it to his valued cooperator C. Edward Graves. Graves and others urged Zahni to use the more common word undisturbed instead. But quoting my grandfather now, the problem with the word disturbed, or undisturbed in that usage, is that most of these areas can be considered as disturbed by the human usages, that is, temporarily disturbed. The idea with the word untrammeled of their not being subjected to human controls and manipulations that hamper the free play of natural forces seems to make this word the most suitable one for its purpose within the Wilderness Bill. To preserve land untrammeled is to respect it as self-willed land. With wilderness, Zahni said, we should be guardians, not gardeners. We should manage wilderness from its boundaries. Zahni said that we should manage wilderness so as to leave it unmanaged. Olis Muri's half-brother Adolf Muri, the expert on wolves, said, quote, "Administrators should be told that their success will be measured not by projects accomplished, but by projects sidetracked." The original handwritten Wilderness Bill would go through 17 drafts between late January 1956 and early July, when it was introduced in the Senate by Senator Hubert H. Humphrey, and in the House of Representatives by John P. Saylor from Pennsylvania. My aunt, Esther Zahniser Gillies, typed one of those 17 drafts. Again, all 10 fingers. Then, between 1956 and 1963, some 65 versions of wilderness bills were introduced. My grandfather worked on revisions for all 65 versions. He also testified at all 18 public hearings on wilderness bills in Washington, D.C. and nationwide. So he flew across the country on a number of occasions to testify at these hearings. He testified at the final April 29, 1964 hearing, days before he died on May 5th. The first wilderness bills introduced in July 1956 met fierce opposition from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Forest Service, and mining, grazing, timber, and hydropower interests. National Park Service Director Conrad Worth leaked an early draft to the mining industry. Thanks for that. The National Park Service opposition is particularly ironic because these same pro-wilderness conservationists had just established the year before at Echo Park the principle of the inviolability of National Park Service lands. The Eisenhower administration, to make matters worse, also opposed the bills. In 1956, my grandfather had a contract with the Alfred A. Knopf publishers to write a book about family wilderness camping. So the family of 6, my grandfather, grandmother, and the 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys, left for 5 wilderness trips, tied together by car camping, just days after the wilderness bills were introduced in Congress in July 1956. They canoed in what is today's Boundary Waters Canoe Area, wilderness in Minnesota. They hiked with pack stock in the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana, Grand Tetons National Park's high country in Wyoming, and the Glacier Peak Primitive Area in Washington. and then they rode the horses in the Cloud Peak primitive area in Wyoming. They were gone for 9 weeks. My dad says that he only slept in a real bed 5 times during this trip. And from this you can guess his general age at the time, but he made up for that by saying that he missed 2 weeks of school, and he got to choose who he wanted to be his 6th grade teacher. So there was an upside. Those wilderness experiences were not lost on the Zahniser children, my aunts and uncles. On a couple of Saturdays in the Wilderness Bill years, my dad and his sisters would lobby with my grandfather on Capitol Hill. At the time, many members of Congress couldn't afford to fly home to their districts for the weekend. So often the senators or representatives were in their offices over the weekend, unprotected and unfiltered by staff. So my aunts and uncles would walk in and leaflet them, giving their spiel for support of the Wilderness Bill. So if they were asked about it by these senators and representatives, they could really speak from experience. Although my dad says he was fairly sure his voice still squeaked at the time. So during those years, my grandfather nicknamed my Aunt Karen's teddy bear Wilderness Bill. Good, an obvious nickname, but sometimes he was also Gladly the Cross-Eyed Bear. The latter nickname punning on the gospel song Gladly the Cross-Eyed Bear. At the 1994 Wilderness Conference in Santa Fe, New Mexico, my dad asked David Brower about one quip that both David and my grandfather used. And Dave said basically they'd worked together for so long it was hard to tell whose jokes were whose at that point. But they carefully mixed metaphors and when they defined wilderness as where the hand of man has never set foot. So, and unfortunately this runs in the family. So, in 1964, looking back, David Brower wrote that, quote, "It was political madness, some political scientists observed, to try to take on so many opponents at one time. They simply didn't have the measure of Howard Zahniser's skill as a constant advocate. His tireless search for a way to put a national wilderness policy into law, his talking and writing and persuading, his living so that the act might be born. The hardest times were those when good friends tired because the battle was so long. Urging those friends back into action was the most anxious part of Howard Zahniser's work." Even within the Wilderness Society itself, there could be unease about the Wilderness Bills. Some feared that the Wilderness Society would lose its nonprofit tax status. Some just grew weary. At one point, even Olis Murray demurred, not wanting to alienate the National Park Service. My dad has 3 images from his childhood of Olis. First is the outdoorsman, very in tune with the more than human world. The second is the world-renowned mammologist lecturing in an auditorium in Washington, D.C. The third is the Olis who danced in the family's suburban living room in his far north Eskimo style. And Dad says that his grandparents would have scorned such dancing if it had been Elvis or Chubby Checker. But it's okay if it's Olis Murray. A Fairbanks friend of Olis questioned the young Marty Thomas at the time. "What are you marrying that fellow for? He's half caribou." Eskimo companions named Murray Little Bird White Man. Murray was later Mr. Elk to many people. He once called an owl down into their camp, to Marty Murray's everlasting amazement. They honeymooned on a 500-mile dog sled trek into Alaskan outback to census wildlife. So if anybody's getting any ideas out here, that's how you woo someone. Marty Murray wrote of Olis, quote, "Olis has a biologist's scorn of allowing anything biological to disturb him. All creatures are a legitimate part of the great pattern he believes in and lives by. He ignored the mosquitoes with a saintly manner that made me furious at times." The cultural ecologist E.N. Anderson writes that conservation is not about natural resources. It's about the social contract. Conservation, he writes, is simply a form of mutual, caring respect. Olis and Marty Murray embodied and lived that. How could such gentle people be such fierce advocates? They epitomized that to advocate, you need not be angry. It's about mutual caring respect. It's about the social contract. The full title of the Wilderness Act, rarely noted or quoted, is this: an act to establish a national wilderness preservation system for the permanent good of the whole people and for other purposes. The Wilderness Act helps us draw the biosphere into our circle of ethical regard. We can recognize ourselves, as Zahni wrote, as interdependent members of the whole community of life on Earth that derives its sustenance from the sun. We are not just independent, but dependent and interdependent too. And preserving wilderness makes some room for permanence as well as for change. It treats remnants of our public domain lands, which we all own in common, as community, not as commodity. These were the tenets of my grandfather's wilderness vision. Naturalist John Hay writes that the whole of life is the source of life. Hay calls wilderness the Earth's immortal genius. Poet Gary Snyder calls wilderness the planetary intelligence. Wilderness and wildness are integral to what the writer and farmer Wendell Berry calls the circumference of mystery. Wilderness and wildness are integral to what poet Denise Levertov calls the Great Web. Wilderness and wildness are integral to what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. calls our inescapable network of mutuality. The call of wilderness is not to escape the world, but to encounter the world's essence. Wilderness calls us to renewed kinship with all of life. We will extend ethical regard only as we feel ourselves as part of the whole community of life on Earth, by securing a national policy of restraint and humility toward natural conditions and wilderness character. The Wilderness Act nudges us towards enlarging the boundaries of that community. In preserving wilderness, my grandfather believed, we take some of the precious ecological heritage that has come down to us from the eternity of the past, and we have the boldness to project it into the eternity of the future. If you are looking for good work, you'll find it in being that link between those two eternities. Go forth, do good, tell the stories, and keep it wild. Thank you.